Welcome to the delightfully unconventional world of Holding Up the Cue. This irregular, irreverent podcast explores esoteric ways of thinking, the magic of storytelling, and some unexpected corners of creativity, taking the Harlequinade as the wellspring of some unusual and fascinating themes. Welcome back everyone to Holding Up the Cue. I've got two very wonderful guests with me today. Christopher Oram, the set designer and costume designer, award-winning set and costume designer, and Brian Selznick, the award-winning writer and illustrator with me. And now I want to explain just a little bit about Holding Up the Cue, something that I don't think's ever been mentioned before. This idea had come from the shop itself, and we called it initially cocktail hour, because what would happen is you'll be in the shop and someone will come in and you'll connect with them, and then before you know it you'll be having a chat about all different things. It goes off into all different tangents, but it will start with something that someone will pick up, bring to the desk, and then suddenly it all begins. So this is what this is. So I've got Christopher and Brian for a super cocktail hour.
Oh, very
so
happy.
This is going to be, I hope, a very enjoyable one.
With glasses of water.
With glasses of water.
Very happy to
no
be here.
alcohol. Right, well, welcome to the studio, Brian and Christopher. First off, we will be talking to both of you separately, but firstly, I will be talking to you, Brian. And so for those who don't know, although I'm sure many people do, Brian is an award-winning writer and illustrator whose illustrated books are part picture book, part graphic novel, and is best known for the invention of Hugo Cabret, which was made into the film Hugo by Martin Scorcese, and more recently his book Wonderstruck turned into a film of the same name by director Todd Haynes. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you so much.
And we're
so
very
happy.
pleased that you're here.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. One thing I want to sort of start with, if we think about your work, very, very sort of instantly, it's black and white, isn't it?
Yeah.
A lot of it's black and white. And a nice connection to make as we are holding up the queue in Pollux is if we think of the theatre sheets themselves, they were known as penny plain, tuppence coloured. And so you would go and buy them plain, and the idea was that you coloured them in. So they have a life, a duality of life. So they can be kept as this black and white image, or then they're transformed and made different by colour. With your work, obviously you draw and it's printed and the effect is in black and white. So you have this wonderful, almost sort of dreamlike quality. Then, of course, it gets turned into a film and it becomes literally living colour. How do you feel? How does that affect you to create something, see it prepared and sort of live in one form, and then suddenly it goes into something else?
Well, I think when I'm working, especially in books, I always think of that the end result is meant to be the form in which I'm working. So when I'm writing a book, I think this is meant only to be a book. It can only exist as a book, and especially because the invention of Hugo Cabret, it's like 600 pages. 300 of the pages are pictures. It's all about what happens when you go back and forth from the words to the pictures and from the pictures to the words. And it celebrates cinema, but ultimately it's about the importance of books.
Right.
And because it is a book.
Yeah.
And so I just didn't think it could be adapted. But then Martin Scorcese called, and John Logan wrote the screenplay. And what they did was they reversed the intention. So it becomes a movie that celebrates books and reading and writing, but ultimately is about the importance of film. And I think that's why it works. And for me, black and white is very much about asking the viewer to participate in imagining what the image is.
Right, so it is almost like it is like a dream, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because
we have, or like it's like a dream. Like I love that early cinema was called that it was likened to going into a dark room and dreaming. And so it is very much like a dream. It's very much like, imagine going through your grandparents' or great-grandparents' photo albums, and you've got these black and white worlds. But of course, the world wasn't black and white. So we have to imagine there's that gap where we get to imagine what the world was based on this black and white imagery.
It's almost like a sort of fairy tale state, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's that act of asking the viewer or the reader to imagine something that I find particularly exciting when I'm working. And so then seeing other artists translate that story into 3 dimensions. Hugo was filmed in 3D, although it looks beautiful in traditional 2D, it was designed to be seen in 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
And so you feel like you're literally going into this world. And Dante Ferretti, who designed the sets for the movie of Hugo, very closely based everything on my drawings. And so and all my drawings are 3 inches by 5 inches.
Really?
Yeah, they're really small.
That's unbelievable. Because I've read the Marvels. I mean, we'll go to that later. But I imagine they would be at least tiny as sort of A4 tiny. I imagine they'd be sort of, I mean, you can't see me, everybody, but I'm sort of doing a big hand movement.
Doing big gestures.
Really, really big.
Yeah, if you take an A4 and fold it in half and then in half again,
yeah,
so that there's those 4 quadrants, that's how big each of the drawings, I could fit 4 drawings on a A4 piece of paper. And then what that does is I work under a magnifying glass with a very sharp pencil, and then what happens is I blow it up to the size that it is in the book, because each drawing in the book is a full page, is a full double page spread. And what it does is it magnifies all the mistakes, it magnifies all the pencil lines, because I want I want my hand as an artist to be visible in it. I don't want my hand to disappear.
No.
Because most artists will work large and then shrink down, and that tightens everything up.
Yeah, and they want everything like a sort of state of perfection, don't they?
Yeah, so I want the opposite. And so because I did all these drawings the size of 1/4 of an A4 piece of paper, walking into a 4-story set, where it's inspired from my little tiny drawing, but
Absolutely.
It's Dante Ferretti's mind. And, and I had been interested in being a set designer when I was younger, which is part of why I love Christopher. Christopher's work so deeply is that sense that you're building the world that the dream takes place on. And so as a children's book writer and illustrator, I in the end I just get to be everything. I get to be the set designer, the lighting designer, the costume designer, the casting director, the director, the script writer. So mostly what I'm saying is I like to be in control.
If we talk about the book Fortunately, when you were a child, tell us about Fortunately.
So Fortunately was my favorite book when I was a kid by an author and illustrator named Remy Charlip. And the premise of the book is that it starts with a full double-page spread, bright color image. It's telling us that it's this boy's birthday, and that he's been invited. He's been invited to a birthday party. That's what it is. That's the first page. But then you turn the page, and the whole page is suddenly black and white, and it's a very sad drawing. And it says, but unfortunately, the party was in Florida, and he was in New York. And then you turn the page, and it's bright color, and something good happens. Then you turn the page, and it's black and white, and something sad happens. And that takes us all the way through the story. So the act of turning the page is actually part of the narrative. It's part of the emotional give and take of the story. And I remember as a kid, you feel a sense of power because you know what's coming. Like, if you're on a color page, it's going to be black and white, or if it's black and white, it's going to be color. But it's that reveal and it's that excitement about what happens when you turn the page. And Remy wrote an essay called "The Page is a Door," which everybody should look up. And it's about the power of the book and what happens when you turn the page. And he likened the turning of a page to the opening of a door or of a curtain in a theater.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when a curtain is closed, anything could be behind.
And it's very
that.
enticing, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's the thrill of knowing that curtain is going to go up, and that anything can be on the other side of that curtain. But in a book, you get that every single page.
Yeah.
So how you use that page turn becomes an important part of how you pace the story.
Wonderful. Christopher, I'm just going to pull you in a little bit here. You're waiting very patiently in the queue.
I am.
But obviously you know the shop as well.
Indeed I do.
And the thing with the penny plain, tuppence coloured. From an aesthetic point of view, I mean, obviously we'll get to that later, but have you seen those before? The things we're talking about with Brian and the scraps and everything, these sort of fragments?
Absolutely. It was actually a designer that I worked for when I was training some few years ago, called Anthony Ward, who was very beguiled by the toy theatres, and he featured one in one of his productions that I was working on, and that was my first kind of real introduction to them, and his interest in them sort of sparked my interest as well, because he was sort of, like sort of regarded as a good word because they're so kind of enticing.
So can you remember when he sort of like, did he like, what's that? Like, did he put it down, or
it was a giant size one. It was for the mask in Tempest, so it was literally blown up to full size. So the three goddesses can then do their mask in the Tempest in it. So that's what it was. That was the RC many years ago.
But one of my favorite things about being a set designer are the models that you make for the sets. Yeah. So there must have been a model of the toy theater that was the size of a toy theater.
Yeah.
Like sort of, and again, like a Russian doll theater.
Yeah. Those models that because I've seen some of your models too, Christopher, and they're so beautiful.
It's how we design. You build a 1 to 25 scale model of the set. So we are basically making toy theatres for a living.
And I think as a kid, like, so many of us love miniatures and love tiny things, because I think when you're a kid, that's what you have control over, because the world is bigger than you are.
Absolutely. I read somewhere you made models. I was sort of fascinated. There's two things that one thing is, I was really abstractly really fascinated with. This isn't it, but the G.I. Joe Island.
Oh yes, I made a G.I. Joe Island in my backyard out of sticks and twigs and bushes, and there were platforms and sunken living rooms and all sorts of things for G.I. Joe to have his escapades on, in a little patch of woods that hadn't been taken down yet to build suburban housing behind my suburban house.
Wonderful.
And then when I was a kid, I read a book called The Borrowers that some of your readers might be familiar with, by Mary Norton, illustrated by Mary and Joe Crush, Krush. And it was about a family of little people that lived under the floorboards of a kid's house. And I basically read it like a documentary.
Yes,
it was a true story.
That's amazing.
And so I used to make little furniture for them and leave it around my house because I was thoughtful. I was aware of the borrowers in my house, and I wanted to help them.
Well, in American folklore, isn't there the thing with the brownies where you have to be nice to them? They're like little. If I've got
like elves.
Yeah, they're elves, and if you're nice to them, they'll do all these like lovely things for you, and if you're not, then they basically you're in trouble.
Right.
So I think I like to romantically think that way back that was in your mind. Yeah.
So so I was very conscious of my love of tiny things, and I did make little dioramas. I made little dollhouse sized rooms, or like rooms that would fit in dollhouses. That were extra small. I had a train station, a train set with a big station on it that I built in my basement, building, and I loved making the landscaping and the lakes and the caves, but making those miniatures when I was a kid was a really big part of my life. And actually, I think the first time that I saw a toy theater was in college. I took a class called Nordic Legacy about Munch, Strindberg, Ibsen, and Ingmar Bergman.
Oh my God.
And at the end, light. It was a little light class, fun, super fun. And at the end, we watched Bergman's films chronological, and so at the end of the semester, we watched Fanny and Alexander.
Of course.
And Fanny and Alexander opens with a shot of the front of a very famous Swedish toy theater that is still in production. I think you can probably get them at Pollock's. The Iltilsen. There's a saying above the top.
Right.
They're still in production.
They're harder to get. We haven't had that for a while. We know that they are hard.
I know. I've seen them. I've seen them at the shop at some point. And so you've got this tight shot of the proscenium of the theater, the paper curtain. And then the curtain rises, and we've got a little paper set and little paper actors, and the actors, looks like they move by themselves. They're being manipulated from underneath. And then the back wall of the paper theater rises, and filling the entire space is Alexander's head, the 12-year-old boy whose theater it is.
Which is a bit like, I'll get it wrong now because my French, most of my language is diabolical. Méliès.
Yeah, Méliès. I usually say the S, Méliès.
Méliès.
Yeah.
Méliès.
Peut-être.
It's a bit like Méliès, isn't it?
Yeah.
Think about it. Have you seen that film, Christopher?
Fanny Alexander,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
required watching.
Yes,
No,
and
no,
as a
but-
child, did you see? Because lots
I didn't
of
see it as a
people.
child.
No. I was going to say that.
You might wonder if I for a little while.
Yeah, call social services. No, Railway Children.
Yes.
Because most of us saw that.
Yes.
And they had that lovely theatre. Do you remember when the little boy is ill in bed?
Yeah.
And so most people that come in, of all different, whoever they are, they will always say, oh, it's like the Railway Children. That's a very clear moment for lots of people who are inspired by the sort of theatrical element, the magical element of the toy theatre itself. It's lovely how it sort of seems to travel through time, doesn't it? It's sort of, it's always there. It's always sort of a witness. But did you make little sort of models and things, or were you interested in the miniature?
I too had a train set.
Right.
And then one day in around sort of 77, the Millennium Falcon landed on it. And slowly
We're
but
going
surely,
to talk about that later.
the Empire kind of took over and the trains kind of got moved aside and the whole thing became a giant spaceport.
Right.
Based on Mos Eisley and Star Wars, and that took over my life for a long time.
Before that moment, though, was it the train set or was it the actual set that interested
it's
you?
building the world. It's,
Yeah.
it's the sculpting the mountains and the viaducts and things.
Yeah.
You can't play with the train set. You just press
No,
a button and
it's,
it goes round in a circle.
thank you, because I never...
It's building.
I always wanted a train set. It was one of the least... I always... Star Wars was something that was, for me, was very butch. And I had a Tonka toy, and everything else wasn't at all. Little House on the Prairie, Holly Hobbie, all that thing. I sort of love that like Victoriana world recreated in the 70s. But there was this train set in this shop on the way to school. And what I loved about it was, and I used to feel really guilty, it was a setup and it was like houses and this sort of track, but these robbers being chased by the police. And I have such a clear memory of that. But like you say, it was a set. So thank you for that's like a guilty pleasure I don't need to feel guilty about. Because like you say, as the trains going around, I think, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
But it was like the world, like this wonderful world. But what was the very first thing that you bought from us?
I think the first thing I bought was an actual tiny black cutout silhouette from the animator Lottie Reininger.
Wonderful.
And she, people think that Walt Disney made the first full-length animated film with Snow White, but actually Lottie Reininger's Prince Ahmed predates it by many years.
Yeah.
And but the whole film is animated, but it's animated with paper cutouts. So she cut out what probably was thousands and thousands of these little silhouettes, each a slightly different position than the one before it. So you photograph one, take it away, photograph the next one, and the illusion is
so stop press animation.
Is the animation
the
of
very
the
early
movement.
form.
And so I have one of my little treasures, this little silhouette of a ballerina, and she just must have been tossed off by Lottie Reininger as one of the millions of silhouettes she's done. But it would fit very comfortably in the palm of your hand.
Wonderful.
And it's got so much life, and so the gesture of her and her arms and
because
her legs.
that's what it was, wasn't it? It was her work was very gestural. But I don't know if you know this, she was a big fan of Méliès.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. So again, that link. And what's interesting about that, and if we look at let's say that, I mean, people listening, go and look her up. You can see her on YouTube, and then if you haven't seen her before, I'm sure you will love it, and you'll see exactly what I mean and we're talking about. When I was doing my research for the Marvels, firstly, there was a photograph of you in the bookstore, the promotion of it, and you're standing next to it's a book stand, but it's like a toy theatre, isn't it? The Royal Theatre. But then there is a wonderful animation that you made, and it's the beginning. I won't give too much away because people should read it, but it's the beginning, the opening of the story, the dramatic opening of the story that sets the scene for everything else. But that has that wonderful gestural, ever so slightly dreamlike, ever so slightly sort of wonderfully sort of primitive in its movement, but obviously the drawing is very, very sophisticated.
Yeah.
So you've
thanks.
got that
Yeah.
link to her.
Yeah, so I eventually I'm also a professional puppeteer, and I've become one of the things I've started doing is creating my own toy theaters that are meant to be toy theaters, not part of another project, and they've been inspired by some of the books that I've done for children, where I want to explore themes for adults. And so even though people often associate toy theaters with children, the toy theater work that I do is for an adult, very specifically for an adult audience. So again, it sort of brings together everything that I love, the theater and the miniatures and the drawing. And so this book that you mentioned, The Marvels, that I did, itself was inspired by a house in London called the Dennis Sievers House in Spitalfields, which many of your listeners might know. And if you don't, you must go immediately. It's a house that's kept as if it's still the 18th and 19th century. So it's not a museum, it's a house. And there's laundry in the corner and half-eaten food on the tables, and you can hear footsteps in other rooms and laughter. You can smell things. The fires are going. It's an uncanny experience, the closest I've ever felt to actually going back in time.
Because someone who went to, I have to confess, I always mean to go. It's one of those things, being in London, you never have enough time, but I will go at some stage. But somebody said to me, it was like a sort of rush. It was almost like being on some strange amusement park, because you would go in and you'd almost, you had to be there, but it felt like you were being really naughty, like you had to sort of move, almost like a theatre, that you moved around it, and the feeling is that those people have just gone out the room and you've got like 10 seconds to run in.
Yeah.
And in the
you feel like you're invading someone's house.
When the boy in the story picks up the thing and eats it. Like that, they said that. When I read that, I thought, oh God, it's exactly like my friend said, that they sort of thought, should I grab that?
Yeah,
they thought, no, they'll come back.
I've become very good friends with David Milne, who's the curator of the house. And the first time he invited me and my husband to come in and experience the house when it was closed to the public, and asked us to sit on a chair, or fed us, something from one of the dishes, or gave us champagne from 18th century flutes. It's a very strange sensation, because you feel like you're in someone else's house, but really it's David's house. I mean, Dennis Sievers was his great friend who died in 1999, and David took over the house after Dennis died. But now, I've been to the house probably, I don't know, dozens and dozens of times. And when it's closed, when it's open, when it's crowded, when it's empty, and it always has a different feeling to it. But The Marvels was inspired by that. And then and it's about a boy who goes to London to meet an uncle who he's never met. And the uncle lives in a house that's very much like the Dennis Sievers house. And I made a toy theater about the Marvels and the beginning of this story, because I created a theater family for my book that starts in 1766 and goes up through 1900. And I created 5 generations of a theater family with all of these dramatic things happening to them. And it starts on a ship at sea, because a lot of the sailors came from the ships at sea in the 18th century, and when they landed, they needed work, and they could climb, and they knew how to tie knots and use ropes. So they all helped build the theaters of London. And there's language from the sea that has worked its way into the theater, like rigging and the deck of a theater.
You liken it to being on a
it's like being in a boat.
I mean, is it like that for you, Christopher? Still, because I've not been behind a theatre for years and years and years. Behind the scenes.
I think the technology has kind of moved on since then. But
slightly less like a ship now.
Yeah,
but more like a spaceship. But it's absolutely, it's like a ship backstage. It was because it was ropes and rigging, and as Brian said, that was very much where that world came from. That started.
Sort of hidden. Yeah, it's like a journey, a little world.
But I love that's where the language comes from, and so I built this little toy theater that is based on the Royal Haymarket, which I did a lot of research in while I was making the book. And then most of this, the toy theater that I then filmed, which you can see online, is mostly done live with, people just off stage lifting up little curtains and moving things in and out.
And your hands come in.
Yeah, you can see my hands.
Is that your... Oh, right,
that's my hand, yes. And, but then I also did a little 10-second stop-motion animation of a dragon, which is part of the story, which took a full day. And it was my first attempt at stop-motion animation, which was really fun, building a stop-motion dragon.
So
and
is that
filming
the Kraken attacking the Kraken?
Yeah, exactly. exactly. The ship is called the Kraken, and that itself is a homage to the great illustrator and writer Maurice Sendak, who did a book called Where the Wild Things Are that many people may know.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And he was one of my mentors, and he was a Melville fan, and Kraken sort of comes out of that world.
Wonderful. With Remy Charlotte, for Hugo, he's Méliès, isn't he? Because you said you talked to him, I read you spoke, you thought, he looks just like him.
Yeah, my friend Dan Hurlin, who's a director, and he's directed the toy theater pieces that I've created and performed. Remy Charlotte, by total coincidence, turned out to have been a professor of Dan's when he was in college. And so Dan introduced me to Remy when I was an adult and had been making books for a long time, and it was such a thrill to meet the person who had made the books I loved most when I was a kid, because besides Fortunately, which we talked about, he made a book called 13 that I loved, which tells 13 simultaneous stories on every page. A book called The Dead Bird, which is really beautiful. Like, he just
had
made
a long, prolific career, didn't he?
Really, and he was also a dancer and a puppeteer and a sign language expert. And he invented something called airmail dances, where he would send drawings of choreography to dance companies, and then they would use those drawings to create their dances. Wow. There were a lot of fascinating aspects to Remy's career, and he was a great teacher.
Right.
And so there were generations of artists who learned under him, one of whom turned out to have been my friend Dan Hurlin. And so I met Remy, and when I met Remy, it was exactly during the time when I was beginning to think about this story that I was writing about a kid who meets the French filmmaker Georges Méliès. And I'd been doing some research. I knew what Méliès looked like. And as you said, when I saw Remy Charlotte, the first thing I thought was, he looks just like Georges Méliès. And so when Remy asked me what I was working on now, because he knew I was a writer and illustrator now, I said, well, Remy, I'm working on a book about Georges Méliès, and you look exactly like him. So would you pose as Georges Méliès in my book? And he said yes. And so the drawings of Georges Méliès in The Invention of Hugo Cabret are actually Remy Charlotte, my hero from when I was a kid.
If we stay with Méliès for a moment, and the idea of he was interested, he had the Theatre Robert Houdin?
Yeah.
And he also which had been at one stage, he was like an incredibly famous magician, and it was full of automata and everything else. And he, I guess, inherited and collected the automata. So he was a collector. And then those things sort of got thrown away, didn't they, sadly? And that was an idea with Hugo. The idea of sort of rescuing things, rescuing fragments. I mean, for both of you in your lives now, what are your home? Do your homes reflect your work? And be honest. Is fragmentation a very important part of the idea process?
Yes, I've kept everything I've worked on my entire career, and it's all about to be re-archived.
Right, okay.
That's a project for the next couple of years, is to sort of go through it all and absolutely kind of index it and work it all out so that it's absolutely accessible.
So it's very important that those, let's say, props, if we use them as a word.
I mean, most of the furniture in our house is props from old shows.
Really?
And one would argue that you kind of prop the show in order to furnish your house.
So that's what you're right. Yeah, that's all you're.
The truth finally comes out.
But it is funny because you sort of go around the studio and you kind of go, well, that's a stool from Don Juan and Soho, and that's the chair from Red, and that's the so that all those things become part of your life because they're part of your creative process.
Yeah.
So they're things that resonate with you and are important to you.
And like the borrower's furniture, they're enchanted objects, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're like talismans or totems.
Yeah.
Brian, I'd love to hear a bit more about Maurice Sendak. Of course, because for most of us, I'm sure you're the same, Christopher, Where the Wild Things Are was a very important book, a very important experience for lots of children. So...
Yeah, Maurice was very important in my life, and I mostly, knew him the way most people knew him, which was through the book Where the Wild Things Are. And I worked in a children's bookstore called Eeyore's Books for Children in New York after I graduated college. And that was really where I learned everything that I know about children's books.
Right.
And I had known of Where the Wild Things Are in my youth, but I never actually read it when I was a kid. So the first time I read it was when I was in the bookstore working as a grown-up. And I have to say, if anybody wants to know anything about how to make a children's book, what the possibilities of a children's book are, what the potential for the form of the book is, you can learn everything you need to learn just from carefully going through Where the Wild Things Are. And if you have a copy in your home, or if you remember it from when you were young, you may recall that when you first open the book, it's almost completely white space with a little rectangular drawing. And it says, on the night Max wore his wolf suit, he made one kind of mischief. And you turn the page, and that little rectangle's a little bit bigger, but it's still mostly white space. And it just says, and another, and you see him making more mischief. And then you turn the page, and the rectangle's a little bit bigger, and it says something like, but his mother called him Wild Thing, and eventually he's sent to his room with no supper. And that very night in Max's room, a forest grew.
Yeah, that's when
and
the
grew.
magic starts.
But of course, what's happening to the drawings? The drawings are growing and growing and
they
growing.
start to go across, don't they?
They go
start
across.
To go to the next page.
And there's still some white space.
Yeah.
And then when it gets to the Land of the Wild Things, there's still white space across the bottom so that you can have place for the language, for the writing. But then we may remember the great wild rumpus. You know, he has a wild rumpus.
Yeah.
And when you turn the page to the wild rumpus, it's the first time the drawing completely covers both pages. It's a full page spread, it's full bleed, which means it goes off the edges. And for 4 spreads, which is 8 pages, you just turn the page and the wild rumpus continues. Max is on their backs, they're howling to the moon, they're hanging from trees. And it's you as the reader that decide when you're going to turn the page. There's no text. There's nothing to tell you when to turn the page. And then once the wild rumpus ends, we come back to some white space. And eventually Max misses...
starts to get bored.
Yeah, he gets bored. He misses his family, his mom. So he goes back home. And he goes back to his room. But now, when he goes back to his room, which had begun in that little tiny rectangle, is now the size of half of a spread of the book. And so the adventure, this release, this temper tantrum that he's had, has had an effect on his physical world. It has grown. He has grown because of what he's experienced. And then the last line of the book is, his supper was still waiting for him, and it was still hot. And so it says his supper was waiting for him in that big drawing of his room, and he looks like he's just come back from the carnival, and he's all sweating. He's all disheveled.
The crowns at one side.
And you see the soup waiting for him on the table, but all it says is dinner was waiting for him, comma, and you have to turn the page to get the rest of the sentence. And you turn the page, and now there's no drawing. It's all white. And it just says, and it was still hot. Yeah. Period.
Yeah, it's like, now leave.
And that's the end.
Yeah.
And for me, being a great illustrator isn't just knowing what to draw, it's knowing what not to draw. And so that's
an interesting point, actually. That's in editing,
isn't
it?
It's editing, and it's about knowing where, trusting your reader, whatever age they are, whether they're 4, whether they're 40, 80, you trust the reader. Yeah. And Maurice trusted children. And it was still hot means, and his mother still loved him. Yeah. Even though he was mean to her and he chased the dog with a fork, his mother still loved him. Yeah. And that, after everything, is saying to kids, you can have a temper tantrum, you can freak out, you can get angry, but guess what? Your mom's still going to love you. It's
contextualization. Yeah. But what's interesting for the both of you, and why I brought this in as well, it's the framing device, isn't it? The framing, sort of the frame within a frame within a frame, which is essential for both of you as creatives, isn't it? And I mean, for you, Christopher, just for a moment, I would have thought that element of like the room going to the forest, for me, when I read that, it was a sort of freeing device, and it made me feel very much like being in a theatre. So, I mean, would that have had some effect on you reading that? Because it's very specific. It's like in the Corsican Brothers. I don't know if you know the play, The Corsican Brothers, which is a really famous toy theatre play. And there's a very gothic, very strange moment where one of the brothers has a supernatural sort of vision of his other brother. I can't remember if they're twins, and he's in a forest doing a duel, and he gets killed. And the room, like where the wild things are, turns partly into a forest. Mm-hmm. So you have that immediate frame within a frame, sort of subtext, subplot, but everything is contained, like it would be in a book, a children's book with images, like it would be on the stage.
Yeah. I think what Brian's been saying is fascinating, because I think there's a lot of subliminal stuff that you sort of take for granted, and you don't realise. It's only when someone explains it like that, and you kind of go, "Oh, I've been manipulated," but also I've been sort of, I've been explained in a way that I didn't quite follow. I didn't instinctively kind of follow, just in terms of illustrations, but actually how they are. And I know this from having talked to Brian in the past about it, that the book is an object in and of itself.
Absolutely,
it's a work of art in itself, not just what's on the page, but how the pages relate to each other and the binding of it and every
it's
aspect
quite a
of it.
physical thing, isn't it? Because when I was like writing down ideas in here, one thing I remember thinking, oh, that's a bit cringe, but actually it's quite relevant now that we're talking about this. With a book, it's sort of like a strange toy, but for me, it's sort of something which is quite romantic, because you go like that.
Yeah.
If you think when you're a kid,
hug it to yourself.
We've all done it. We've all walked home or walked through the school with a book, and it's like a protection. But there's that intimacy.
Yeah.
Yeah. When Hugo was first published, I had no idea if kids were going to like it, because it's a book about French silent movies,
right?
Which is not real, guaranteed bestseller. And the first school that I went to, I got there early, and the kids had read early copies of the book. And the first kid I saw was a little girl holding Hugo like that to her chest. And I just thought, that must be a good sign. Like that means that you, because like you fall in love with the object, you fall in love with the stories, you fall in love, with your. You see yourself in the characters in the world, and everything I just described about Where the Wild Things Are, you shouldn't be conscious of. No. If you were conscious of it, it would be a bad book.
Yeah.
The fact is that it's there, and we all love Where the Wild Things Are, and we talk about our connection. People have Where the Wild Things Are tattoos. Like the name Max is has become really popular since it was first published in the 1960s, and I think we talk about our love for the story, but it's all of that other stuff. I don't even know how conscious Maurice was of everything I just described. For me, I very rarely know what my work is about while I'm making it. I just have something that interests me, and then this is like the scraps you were talking about. I have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and that interests me, and that, and I pull it all together. And when, and again, after Hugo was published, an adult reader came up to me at a signing and said, "I love that this book is about how we make our own families." And I was like, "It is?" And of course it is.
Yes, it is.
It's I knew that I wanted Hugo to be safe, and to he's an orphan and he's living alone in the walls of the train station. But when she said that to me, I realized that was the point of everything I had been making, and it was the point of everything I had been doing, and then it became the point of everything I did. So after Hugo, I did a book called Wonderstruck, and then after Wonderstruck was The Marvels, and all of those books are about how we make our own families. But I learned that from a reader.
That's a sort of link to both of you as well, because if all elements of your work, if you dip in and pick this, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm being a bit lazy, but it's that thing again of fragmentation, of sort of fragmented families, a family dynamic, fathers and sons, or mentors. And like with Peter and Alice, you have that, don't you? That element of these characters who are influenced by each other. And then, but within that is this little sort of subcontext of this sort of make-believe world, this sort of survivalist make-believe sort of system. And I don't know, maybe that's why I say with Hugo, it was that element of sort of, it appealed to children, the lost and the found.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that's partially why orphan stories are so popular. And, Harry Potter's an orphan, of course. Charles Dickens wrote about orphans.
Just to interrupt you for a second, you have reimagined the covers, haven't you, for Scholastic?
Yes, I did get to do the 20th anniversary covers for Harry Potter, which was the single most terrifying job request I think I've ever gotten. That was a phone call I won't forget. But I got the chance to, and by the time I got the phone call, I myself was a huge fan of the Harry Potter books. But the reason that we identify so strongly with these orphan stories, I think, especially for kids in safe houses, for kids in with good parents, we love orphan stories because no matter what our situation is, when you're a kid, it relates to what we were talking about with miniatures earlier. You have very little control, or you feel like you have very little control, and a literary orphan has complete agency. A child in a story who has no parents and is out in the world on their own has to make every choice, has to figure out where they're going to live, how they're going to eat, and it's terrifying. But for the reader, you're safely able to read about that terror, which we all then do. Like we all do leave our family, and we do head out into the world.
Well, that was the importance of fairy tales, wasn't it? And that's why it's so odd now that some people are very critical or very worried about the subtexts and context of them.
They always have been.
Exactly. They are a coping strategy.
Yeah. There was a great child psychologist named Bruno Bettelheim who went to war with Maurice Sendak where the Wild Things came out because he said it was going to damage children.
Because didn't he write the uses and abuses of enchantment?
Yeah, and you would think of all people he would get what Maurice was doing.
I'm quite shocked by that.
They hated each other. And because I guess he was still looking at this idea that saying that it's okay to be angry to a child is potentially dangerous or is potentially giving a kid ideas. We all think that kids lead these idyllic lives, but if we all remember to when we were kids, that's not what it was like. And Maurice always says, like when people would ask him, what should you tell children? What shouldn't you tell children? He would say, tell them whatever you want. Yeah. Like they'll handle it, or they self-censor.
Well, they're going to come across it at some point.
Yeah. Or they probably know more than you do.
And
they probably know more than you want them to.
Yeah.
Especially now.
Yeah.
But I think that's always been the case. And Spike Jonze, who directed the Where the Wild Things Are movie, made a short documentary about a visit to Maurice's house, and it's called something like "Tell Them Whatever You Want."
Right.
And it really gives, and I think you can find it on YouTube, but it's a really great. It gives you a really great sense of what it was like to visit with Maurice in the woods.
Everyone, absolutely, that sounds great. Okay, I think just glancing over Brian's shoulder now, there are some very angry faces because everyone's been kept in the line a long time. And poor Christopher is waiting behind.
Very patiently.
So I think if we get Brian just to stand to one side next to the PDQ for a moment. Thank you, Brian. And now we will introduce again Christopher Oram for the next episode of Holding Up the Queue.
Thank you.
Okay, next customer, please. Thanks for listening to Holding Up the Queue. These podcasts are created by Benjamin Pollock's Toy Shop in Covent Garden, at the heart of London Theatreland for over 80 years. Find out more about Benjamin Pollock's by visiting our website, pollocks-coventgarden.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter at Pollock's Toy Shop and join the conversation at #HoldingUpTheQueue.